All righty. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2023-2024 Ethics Grand Rounds presented by us here at the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics. My name is Brian Leland. I am the director of the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics and the medical director for Peds Ethics over at Riley Hospital. And I am the fellowship director here at FCME. It is a pleasure to welcome you all. A couple announcements here. First and foremost, please use the text code on the screen that I have now swapped over to, so you can get your CE or CME. Certificates are being sent out about 30 days after the lecture, so don't be confused if it takes a minute for you to get it. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, which is fairbankscenter.org, within the next week or so. We do encourage you to send it to your colleagues or give them the means by which to access it. During today's presentation, if you have questions or thoughts, please pop those in the chat box if you are joining us virtually, but we probably won't get to those until the end of the lecture in order to honor our speaker's time. Speaking of which, Kelsey has no relevant financial conflicts of interest to disclose. I think lastly, I just want to say that as we hopefully are out of a period where we're going to be formally always virtual due to COVID-related things, fingers crossed, that we implore you to come back physically to be present for our ethics grand rounds. Our speakers are feeling lonely up here at the podium, speaking into a vast abyss, knowing that there are a bunch of people online, but not physically present. So we hope that you'll join us in person. And we have a couple upcoming lectures. The next one will be October 4th. Myself, Ann Hannon, and Nan Shrivastava will be giving an update on pediatric ethics at Riley Hospital for Children. And then our November 1st lecture is Reverend Leah Gunning-Francis. And then we have December 6th is Dr. Katzenellen Bogan, say that 5 times fast, who's going to be presenting with Dr. DeMaglio and Kelly Donahue about the gender affirming care law in Indiana. Okay, I gave you that. I am so excited to introduce, before we start our lecture, our new fellowship class. And since the entirety of the audience is the fellowship class, I will not make you stand up and say hello, but I do want to acknowledge you and welcome you formally, starting with, in no particular order, Dr. Jatinder Dhami, who is a Peds Critical Care Fellow over at Riley Hospital and is waving. Danny Gardner, who is the Manager of Transplant and Oncology at Methodist. Patrick Holtum, a nurse anesthetist at Riley Hospital for Children. Dr. Lex Kaiser, a 4th-year neurology resident at Eskenazi. Marcy, is it Memer or Memmer? Memmer, program manager at Community Benefit and Health Policy here at IU Health. Kellen McCormick, clinical operations manager for cardiac ICU at Ball Memorial Hospital. Joshua Sumner, who's the senior social worker for organ transplant at University Hospital. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Allison Toback, who is a Peds Hemonc fellow over at Riley. Pediatrics rocks. I'm going to hand things over now to Annie Motz, who will introduce our speaker. I missed somebody?
We have one more fellow. We have Miranda Lynch.
Oh, it is on my list, Miranda. I'm so embarrassed. She knows I did it on purpose. So Miranda Lynch is an inpatient pharmacist at Eskenazi, who officially dislikes her fellowship director.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I know that I am not usually the face you see up here for introductions. My name is Annie Motz. I'm the project manager for the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics. However, I am very excited to introduce my good friend and colleague, Kelsey Miller, today. I remember when Kelsey interviewed with us in 2017, she actually joined us as an administrative assistant in 2017. And I have been inspired by her growth in her both academically, professionally, personally throughout our department in the years. So Kelsey is the project manager for the Department of Clinical and Organizational Ethics for the IU Health System and has been with us, again, like I said, for 5 years. She's the founder and program manager of the Family Support Program, which provides services and supplies to family members of actively dying trauma patients and was made possible by receiving a values grant from the Evans Center for Spiritual and Religious Values in Healthcare. She completed the Fairbanks Fellowship in Clinical Ethics in 2022, focusing her project on organizational ethics. She received a master's in healthcare administration in 2021 and a master's in leadership development in 2022. She's a unit-based ethics conversation facilitator and recently received her healthcare ethics consultation certification through ASBH. Kelsey is married to her husband, Chris, and they have twin boys, Hudson and Maddox, who will be 3 in November. And if you do the math in your head, you will realize she earned 2 master's degrees while she had 2 twin babies. She enjoys being outdoors, traveling with family, and watching professional sports, reading, and is a huge fan of true crime podcasts and documentaries. So welcome, Kelsey.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Almost brought some tears to my eyes. So yeah, I'm so excited to be here with you all today, equally as nervous, so take it easy on me, please. Like Brian said, Dr. Leland said, there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. And if you are virtual, you can place them in the Q&A box at any time throughout the presentation. And then Annie will give those questions to me at the end. And I wanted to say welcome to the fellows. I'm sure many of you will have the opportunity to stand up here and present your fellowship work someday. So, all right, today we will learn about clinical organizational ethics by contextualizing clinical organizational ethics issues, considering the Joint Commission's requirements of ethics at healthcare institutions, differentiate organizational ethics, professional ethics, business ethics, and clinical ethics, identify the necessary components for a successful clinical organizational ethics program, and one that closely mimics how we handle clinical organizational ethics here at IU Health, and demonstrate how decision-making aligns with the organization's mission, vision, and values. So a little bit of background. Historically, JCO's only requirement for addressing ethics within the healthcare institutions were to conduct business in an honest, decent, and proper manner. In August of this year, there was an update that went into effect for leadership who are addressing ethical issues. The update does not introduce a new requirement or new expectations for compliance, but rather reinforces a longstanding expectation for the accredited healthcare institutions. So JCO's new code of conduct states that the organization must develop and implement a process that allows staff, patients, and families to address ethical issues or issues prone to conflict. So what it all boils down to is that JCO requires some type of mechanism, but does not have a requirement as to what that mechanism is, which is kind of a shame because they could play a huge role in elevating the professionalism and value of ethics programs nationally, with some enhanced standards and encouraging the formal attention to best practices. So currently the type of issues that a lot of healthcare organizations address are related to professional or business ethics. But we aren't here to discuss JCO's lack of requirements. I just wanted to simply state that the lack of a standardized mechanism for addressing ethics could be why organizations haven't implemented a type of clinical organizational ethics program in the past, or have struggled to do so if they attempted. So as you can imagine, there are a ton of ethical issues that arise in the hospital setting. It's important to make a distinction between all of the different types of ethics that come up. So professional, business, clinical, and organizational ethics, as people do tend to use them interchangeably. And as one could imagine, there are different levels and areas of expertise in each of these different areas. So as you read through these definitions on your own, you may see that there are some similarities between these 4 definitions, but you'll also see that there is some insufficient attention within the definition, specifically of organizational ethics, that include reference to the actual ethical issues that arise in the clinical setting of healthcare organizations. It's generally recognized that organizational issues can be quite different from clinical matters. So if organizational ethics concerns are to be addressed within the scope of clinical ethics, a separate track or process may be necessary. As if we don't already have enough definitions and terms to sift through, we propose a new term and definition. So we have taken two concepts from the previous slide and combined them into one to address bedside ethical dilemmas at the system level. So for the purpose of this presentation, this is the definition and the new term, clinical organizational ethics, and the definition we are proposing. So COE, because I'm not going to continue to say clinical organizational ethics over and over again because it's a lot. COE refers to the ethics issues that affect patients, but are not isolated to single patient encounters. They are recurrent clinical ethics issues that require a systematic approach to ensure that all patients are being treated in a consistent and equal manner. When making system level decisions, organizations tend to align their decision-making with either their mission, vision, or values. As I'm sure you're all aware, IU Health strives to promote their values at any time possible. So as an ethics consultant trying to address these ethics issues at a system level, doing so by addressing issues in relation to the values will likely encourage and promote leadership buy-in and will help serve as a foundation for change. So generalizing this to a clinical organizational ethics framework, decision-making should be centered around the organization's vision, mission, or values. And that could vary with healthcare organizations, whatever organizations promote the most is what they typically will surround their decision-making with. So as you can see here, I have researched the values of 4 healthcare organizations, and presumably the expectation of each institution is that decision made by team members should align with these values. So therefore, conducting COE consults, ethics consultants should use the organization's values to guide their decision-making, recommendations, policy work, and to help create a positive ethical climate. All right, so now we will distinguish the difference between clinical organizational ethics and clinical ethics. So hopefully many of you are aware that we have a clinical ethics consultation service here at IU Health. If you don't know, you do now, and I will give you contact info on how to get a hold of us. Sorry to whoever's on call. So that service is a little bit different than what this program that we're proposing here. The clinical organizational ethics program is issue-based recurrent clinical ethics dilemmas, whereas clinical ethics is individual, patient-based, and an isolated issue involving one single patient. COE issues impact multiple patients at the conclusion of the consultation, whereas clinical ethics consultations directly impacts the single patient, typically in their current hospitalization. COE consults are typically requested by an organization's team member, whereas clinical ethics consults can be requested by patients, families, and any other healthcare provider or anyone involved in the patient's care. Leadership is often involved in the clinical organizational ethics consults, and we'll address that here shortly. Whereas leadership buy-in isn't as necessary in the clinical ethics consultations with the single patient encounters, unless it's preferred by the ethics consultant, the clinical team, or the ethics committee. The end product is pretty different between the two. So for COE consults, they typically result in a policy change or implementation, a procedure implementation or revision, or potentially legislative or governmental action. And a clinical ethics consult results in recommendations given to the clinical team, specifically related to the patient that we were contacted for. All right, now we're getting into the good stuff. So now that we have a better understanding of the differences between the many different types of ethics within a hospital that are used interchangeably, the difference between clinical organizational ethics and clinical ethics, we will move into the discussion of how a COE program might be structured within a large healthcare system and the important pieces that should be included. First thing is the ethics infrastructure, which can vastly vary across organizations depending on the size and type of location, whether it's a large academic health center in a city or a smaller critical access hospital in a rural area. The development of the ethics infrastructure is crucial to the success of the program and to ensure the system is making decisions that are in alignment with the values and or mission or vision of the organization. Different approaches may guide how an organization implements their program, but a good starting point would be to create ethics committees, subcommittees, collaborate with leadership, along with other departments to help build a working relationship, and also provide ethics education to team members across the system. So as you can imagine, COE issues are often embedded within clinical ethics consults, and they often arise while working through these clinical ethics consults. So it makes sense that this type of program would be housed within or operated by an ethics department or an ethics committee. Another reason to house this kind of program within the ethics committee or department is because these members already likely have the education needed, the education, training, and experience needed to take on the role of handling these consults. And not everywhere is blessed like we are here at IU Health with a designated that department I work for, the clinical ethics department, to handle the clinical ethics consultation service and additionally this type of program on top of that. So just like our smaller hospitals, many organizations only have the volunteer armies to be able to do any type of clinical ethics work. So oftentimes people don't have the time or the expertise to do this kind of work. So that's why it's important to house this type of a program within the ethics committee. COE implicates underlying issues across healthcare systems. Therefore, a successful program requires collaboration across multiple disciplinaries, as well as buy-in from leadership who could be called on to assist in changing practices, revising policies, or working towards legislative change, and also to assist in the awareness of the program's existence across the organization. A well-established program can create space for a variety of experts, including nursing, social work, psych, chaplaincy, risk, and other clinical and non-clinical specialties to collaborate and communicate openly to identify the multiple dimensions of any ethical dilemma. A well-functioning COE program should not only improve patient care, but should also strive to improve the morale of the team members at the organization. The quote here on the screen implies the importance of multi-directional conversations between leadership and clinicians or other healthcare professionals to give them a voice and request change at the system level while alleviating moral distress and building trust among the team. So this shows why the inclusion of stakeholders from all levels and specialties are crucial to the program's success. Aside from leadership, other stakeholders of the program, along with the others that I just mentioned, would be government affairs, and then any other service lines at the forefront of emerging ethical issues such as reproductive health, and also any medical or nursing schools if you're at a large academic health centers, whose procedures or training could be implicated based on the recommendations that we're recommending. Okay, another thing I'm sure you're all aware of is the importance of the reportable metrics that healthcare systems mandate. So healthcare systems emphasize reportable metrics as a way of monitoring productivity and improvement. while clinical ethics consults, so those single patient encounters, are relatively easy to count with a tally, or we like to total up the numbers we spend on consults. COE consults are a bit more difficult to track. Because work on a COE consult may extend several weeks or even several months, tabulating hours becomes difficult. Likewise, the tally tends to be pretty low for clinical organizational ethics, perhaps just 1 or 2, 3 a month. So one way we determined healthcare systems could classify COE issues is into 2 categories: simple and complex. So a simple COE issue is classified as an issue that can be resolved with a quick lit review or a review of policies or procedures within the organization, or policies or procedures of outside organizations to see how others are potentially addressing the specific issue that's in question. These are typically resolved within a few days. And the deliverable with a simple COE issue could be as simple as a recommendation in the form of a memo, or even an email to the team that requested the clinical organizational ethics consult. And those memos do include the ethical analysis and the recommendations given as well. Occasionally, a quick turnaround time is required. Therefore, verbal recommendations are the only feedback that are given to the team. This is very rare, but an example of a scenario when verbal recommendations could be given was during the COVID times, when there was no literature or things to review and no previous pandemic similar enough to research. So in contrast, a complex clinical organizational ethics consult is one requiring a more extensive lit review and collaboration with outside experts. While they both, simple and complex, will have key stakeholders involved, complex COE issues tend to have more or tend to have the leadership involved in these. The deliverable would likely be a revision to a policy or procedure, or the development of a new policy or procedure at the organizational level, or potentially a proposed legislative change. Complex COE consults can take several weeks to months, potentially years to complete, but we try to avoid that. All right, now that we have an understanding of what COE is, the importance of the ethics infrastructure and leadership involvement, and how to monitor productivity, we're now going to discuss how an ethics consultant within the COE program can address these types of consults. So of course, this program wouldn't be a thing if there were no ethics issues, and there always are. So of course, somebody identifies the COE issue and contacts the COE consultant. Contacting the COE consultant can be done through the hospital operator or directly with the consultant via phone or email. Of course, this is going to be different at other institutions, but however they contact their ethics committee or potentially any other on-call services, so it could be via diagnosis, however the organization wishes. The next step would be the intake step. So the consultant would gather the information from the requester regarding the ethical issue. The consultant will then determine who they would want to include as key stakeholders to help in the next steps of the consult. So they want to identify who those people are, or who the departments could be that they would like to take this issue to. The refers consult would be only necessary if the issue was determined not to be an ethical dilemma. So then the COE would refer the consult to the appropriate person to address the issue, whether it be legal, risk, patient advocates, etc. If that was the case, the consultant would then not continue on with the following steps, but for the sake of this, we're going to pretend it is an actual ethical issue. So then the consultant and the key stakeholders would collaborate together in determining how they were going to proceed with the comprehensive review of the issue, and what avenues they need to go down, whether it be looking at the organization's policies and procedures, looking outside of the organization, looking at literature mostly, or looking at legislation, all of those things. At this point is when the consultant should be able to determine if this issue should be categorized as simple or complex. The consult doesn't necessarily need to be determined simple or complex at that point. It's just, you want to make sure that you're monitoring your productivity. So making sure you remember all the work you put into it so you can identify it as simple or complex. That way you can report it is super important. The next step is to communicate recommendations. This step will depend on the COE issue and what is being requested from the ethics team. Typically, a memo with an ethical analysis along with recommendations are drafted for the team. There are those occasions where you provide the verbal recommendation. And then the last step is to identify the next steps and produce deliverables. So if the end goal was to develop or revise a policy or procedure, the requester can use the memo with the ethical analysis and recommendations to make those changes. And they can contact the ethics consultant or the ethics department or committee throughout that process, or if additional assistance is needed. So essentially we give the recommendations and the ethical analysis, and they take it and make those changes, and we're available to help if necessary or if needed. So as you've heard multiple times, these are the outcomes or deliverables of a COE consult. They can vary, but with a memo, ethical analysis, and recommendations, the outcomes often result in a policy or procedure revision or implementation, could be legislative action. So here are some examples of COE issues that healthcare organizations could potentially address. I will briefly highlight a few that I have personally been a part of. So if you have questions on any of the others, I will refer you to somebody else who can answer them better. So I have recently created a patient-facing dispute resolution graphic, which was created as a communication tool for team members to use when having conversations with patients or surrogate decision makers regarding the dispute resolution process. That's still going through channels, but key stakeholders were legal, to make sure, you know, what we have on this document is supported by our legal team. It will go through the brand center to make sure it covers has all of IU Health's pretty colors and all of those things. And of course, our whole ethics team and others I'm sure I'm forgetting about in this moment. The next one is kind of a more broad one, which is the policy language consultations, where revisions to policies occur when language needs to be changed because of a procedural or process change or a change in legislation that implicates the patient population. The ethics department owns, I think, 6 or 7 of these policies. While we own those and revise those, we don't technically consider those clinical organizational ethics issues. Maybe we should, but because we own them, we're required to update them and keep them up to date anyways. But we do get called upon to have a say in language and other policies. So for instance, the pain policy or others that just aren't coming to my mind right now. And then the last one, I think that, 2 more. So the next one, the screening athletes for exploitation. There's a nationwide concern for athletes who are being sexually exploited by their coaches, team doctors, and trainers, along with other people on, athletes on the team or others that are in a higher level than, the athletes are. So we've created a screening tool for physicians to use when conducting annual physicals for student athletes. The screening tool consists of a short questionnaire that the athletes will answer. And if answers raise any red flags, the physician will then have a further in-depth conversation with these athletes. So the tool is ready and awaiting to be piloted by a sports medicine clinic. So that one has taken a little bit longer to create, but now we're just waiting to pilot it to see how it could potentially go. And the last one would be procedural and policy differences across a healthcare system that has multiple locations and varies in sizes, such as IU Health. We have a large academic health center here, and then we've got Ball Memorial, which is in a smaller rural area. Lots of, different sizes and locations. So those smaller hospitals may not have the resources that larger hospitals have, but to have procedures and policies that closely mimic each other. So if, for instance, a nurse goes from Methodist to Ball and the procedures are on opposite ends of the spectrum, they may not know what resources are available to them or what procedures they should be following. So it's important to try as best as possible to have procedures and policies that closely mimic each other. So here are two examples of clinical organizational ethics issues that we have handled at IU Health, and a better way of viewing all of the parts of the program that we just discussed. So as you can see, the ethics issues, the type of consult. So we've got one simple and one complex, the requesters, key stakeholders, and then the end product and result or deliverable. So as you can see here, on the one on your left, we worked with the Department of Family Medicine, or the requester was the Department of Family Medicine. Key stakeholders included the Department of Family Medicine, legal, hospital administration. And this one is an example of verbal recommendations. On the right, this was a more complex issue, one that was brought up due to a concern of legislation that was about to be passed. So it was a more complex issue. The requester was government affairs, and of course, the key stakeholders always includes ethics, but government affairs, the School of Medicine, because this issue was going to potentially implicate the way that they taught their learners. And then the end product was recommendations that were forwarded to the legislator. Okay, so there are oftentimes misconceptions that we hear about in the ethics department. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to clear up some of these misconceptions. So the first one being, and these are misconceptions for mostly clinical ethics consultations, but they are the same for the clinical organizational ethics issues as well. So only physicians can request ethics consults. No. Clinical ethics consultations and clinical organizational ethics issues can be requested by any provider, anyone involved in the patient's care, including the patient themselves or their family. Clinical ethics consultations and clinical organizational ethics consultations can only be requested for inpatient issues. This is also false. Clinical ethics consults and COE issues or consults can be requested at any of the IU Health facilities, whether it's outpatient at an outpatient office, such as the sports medicine consult that I just discussed, or in the hospital. Recommendations given by the ethics consultant or team must be followed by the clinical team. This is false. We have heard from team members that in the past, ethics recommendations were given, but nothing happened. We provide recommendations as a way of supporting the team, and they're not considered the mandatory plan of care to follow, but we hope that they follow our recommendations. So we hope that our recommendations are taken into account and utilized and used to help promote the plan of care for the patient, whether it's a clinical ethics consult or help to promote a better implementation of a policy or a more systematic procedure or whatever the case may be. So we acknowledge that our recommendations aren't always taken. And while we may be frustrated, there are typically good reasons as to why these recommendations aren't taken. But teams do seem to be frustrated when we give recommendations and they think that the team has to follow them. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Okay, so just a little side note here. Annie mentioned that I was in the ethics fellowship. So this presentation was work that I completed during my ethics fellowship. And my article was selected for publication in MedStar's Journal of Hospital Ethics in February. Jane Hartsock was my mentor for this project and throughout my fellowship. So special thanks to Jane and also to Amy Martin for their support. Okay, so whoever has the on-call phone, turn it off silent because you may be getting some consults now. If you have a clinical organizational ethics request, you can email me or FCME. That's our general email address that is operated by multiple people. So if you send it to that email, it will get directed to the appropriate person. If you have a clinical ethics consult, so related to a single patient that you have an ethics question regarding, to request a consult for that, you can search for our diagnosis room. So the HEC ethics consult room is our room here downtown. So that does include Methodist, Uni, and Riley. Or you can call the hospital operator and ask for the ethics consultant on call. I will say, be very careful when if you do go the diagnosis route, because every region has a diagnosis room now, and you just want to make sure that you have the appropriate room. If you do not, they will call you and kindly tell you you do not have the right room, and then hang up and be excited when they don't have to address that consult. I'm just kidding. Everybody's excited to address the consults. But don't be worried that you have the wrong room. Somebody will get you to the correct room. Just tell them where you're at and that you're trying to request an ethics consult, and they'll get you to the right place. All right, to wrap up and with plenty of time for questions, like I imagined, integrating a clinical organizational ethics program into healthcare systems could allow for positive systematic change that could ultimately improve patient care while alleviating moral distress amongst the clinical team. Ensuring there is a set standard of care across an organization that aligns with their mission, vision, or values is what a clinical organizational ethics program should strive for when implementing their program, along with the other pieces I have included today. And I will take any questions at this time. Oh, 2, okay.
Kelsey, that was absolutely wonderful. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more on the distinction between a simple and complex consult, because it feels like, it's a little bit of a gestalt, like this felt more complex or this ended up being more simple. But are there other metrics or differentiators that can help delineate simple and complex consults?
I feel like it, another way that you could differentiate could be by the deliverable. So if it resulted in legislative change, that's a pretty big deal. So I feel like that would be complex, whereas if you, no ethical issue is ever simple or easy to handle per se. So having them be simple isn't, I mean, that's maybe not the best word, but if it is a memo with an ethical analysis and recommendations that are given in a reasonable amount of time that didn't take a whole lot of brain power and a whole lot of people, I would say that that's simple. Unfortunately, it's kind of just your perception of how much work you put into it. And of course, just because this is our way of doing it, we would love to hear if there are other ways that other organizations do it. I don't think that they exist though, but so yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Kelsey, for laying that out so systematically. I wonder if you can share, are there times when the organization, and I think what I mean by this is the ethics organization, pulls out and realizes that an organizational ethics consult needs to happen, even though one has not been called yet? So like, oh my gosh, we've had this, this, and this from all these different floors, but because we are the ones that lay our eyes on everything, which is different. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So a big part of my role in my day job, and one thing that we rely heavily on is data. And so, and because our department is small, we're blessed because our department is small and we all eat lunch together every day. And there are only a handful of people who do ethics consults. We're able to discuss them at lunch and see from the data these issues that keep arising from the clinical consults that are occurring. So if Jane's on call 1 month and she gets 2 of the same type of consults, and then Brian, Amy, Robin, Matt, whoever's on the next month and has a handful of this same type of issues, they don't necessarily have to be requested by somebody within the organization, because they can essentially arise from the clinical ethics consults and be requested by us to address change. So yeah, we rely heavily on the data and the fact that we have a small group of people who communicate openly about and work together on these types of, on the clinical consults.
Kelsey, I have one from online. In attempting to recreate a version of this process in other sectors or industries, what resources do you recommend starting with?
Leadership buy-in. I think having leadership buy-in to create any sort of process or procedure or program is imperative, no matter if it's in the healthcare industry or in the construction industry, which I only use that example because that's the industry my husband's in. So
I'm curious on the algorithm for clinical and organizational ethics. There was one about a referral if it wasn't an ethical issue. What are some examples of topics and issues that were referred out? And then how did you communicate to the person who initiated the ethics consult?
sure. I'm going to defer this to somebody who has more clinical ethics consultation experience. So Jane Hartsock, thanks.
So I got a request for a clinical ethics organizational consult. I'll be kind of vague about this, from somebody who was concerned about OR procedures and billing. And so my response to that was, this is not actually a clinical organizational ethics issue. This is actually probably like a regulatory affairs or revenue cycle problem, and may actually potentially be a legal problem. And so that's not us. And so you should call, what I think it's the helpline. Well, was at that time, it's a different line now, but we've also gotten some organizational ethics consult stuff that's really professionalism kinds of things. A request for us to intervene at an organizational ethics level in response to some pushback that people were offering on their, I guess, leeway time to come in when on call for, I mean, that's just like, that's not us, sorry. So that's kind of the stuff where we realize like, okay, but this isn't quite our department, but we're really glad that you saw us as potential helpers and let us get you to the people who are the actual helpers for this issue.
I have another one from online, and I think I'm gonna ask this correctly. So the question specifically is, do ethics issues have an expiration date, meaning it comes to light long after the issue occurred? So in going back to Robin's question, is there a time frame on the pattern of those consults and those ethics issues that you see before they can become an organizational issue?
No, I think if you're seeing it over and over again, that's when it is a clinical organizational ethics issue and you should bring it up. I guess it depends on what's happening as to how many times it occurs before you contact us. But I mean, call us. Worst case scenario, you call us and we do our research and we address it and nothing happens, right? But I think if it's something that's occurring often enough that it's swirling around in your head, call us. I also feel like maybe there's a little bit of moral distress in that, which is not my area of expertise. That's Matt's, and he can give a lecture on that some other day. But if you feel like you do have some moral distress, also call us because we have a program for that. So I'm just gonna put in all the plugs here.
All right, well, nobody else has any questions. Kelsey, thank you so much. We will see you guys next month. Please join us in person at Riley. Thank you.
Thank you. Jatinder, I did think of you when I put the Grinch up there. I mostly thought of, oh, we're still recording. Do you want me to end?